gender affirming mental health care, gender affirming therapy is less so like a particular intervention or a particular technique and more so a perspective that views gender diversity or gender expansiveness, which is people who are identifying outside of the gender binary and people who are sort of exploring their gender identity in comparison to their sex assigned at birth. The perspective of gender affirming mental health care is to support the idea of gender diversity and not pathologize it. So, in the historical context, both transgender people as well as the grander like queer community were pathologized to the point of having diagnoses in the DSM that were like a mental disorder based on an identity characteristic. So gender affirming mental health care is kind of pushing back against that historical context that has tended to just pathologize identity characteristics of transgender people that sort of sends the message of who you are is wrong and it should be fixed. Gender affirming mental health care is sort of providing a counterpoint to that, and opposing that, coming more from sort of the social work, ethical principles of the strengths based perspective, thinking about gender diversity as not a bad thing, in fact, having lots of strengths. And of course, within that perspective, there are tons of different techniques, things to keep in mind. But when we talk about it in the general sense, a lot of it is sort of having that, it's more of a like framework or a perspective, with ideas that you can kind of embody throughout the course of treatment. I am very passionate about the idea of connecting sort of macro factors, so like societal level factors, with individual outcomes. I think that one very, very poignant example of that with regard to the trans community, especially right now, is nationwide, there are over 530 different pieces of legislation that are either passed or pending in state legislatures that are pretty directly attacking some pretty basic fundamental rights of the trans community, particularly trans youth, which, we don't serve necessarily the youth population, but I do think that it's really important because we often will get clients who have just exited that age range. So we might be seeing clients who are still experiencing some of the residual effects of being limited in legal and socio-political factors. So some of the rights that are sort of at risk right now are participation on school sports teams that align with one's gender identity, access to gender affirming healthcare more holistically. We might see that be in part about mental health care, and limiting those types of resources. It sort of remains to be seen. And then that's sort of a backdrop to the recent presidential election. I saw a statistic recently that the Trump campaign spent over 40% of their campaign TV advertisements specifically addressing like anti-transgender sentiment. So that sort of exemplifies the position of attacking transgender rights that this presidential administration will likely have. Those are all going to be minority stressors, not only for the transgender folks who live in states that are passing a lot of this legislation. I'm in New York City, the dorm is in New York City and DC. In both of those locations, there are some like state level legal protections, but there is research that's sort of like emerging that speaks to what's called like ambient harms of just the discourse and the rhetoric that has been sort of created as a result of all of this legislation. So an example of that is me, an adult in New York City, has an awareness of these campaign ads that were being run, even though I didn't see any of them myself. And then it sort of validates and affirms for individuals who might resonate with anti-transgender sentiment. It sort of permits them to be discriminatory or that type of thing more publicly, potentially. All this is to say, the legislative landscape is a very, very prominent minority stressor, not only for the folks who live in states where things are being very heavily restricted. And so I think that that all means that it's more important now, and the importance is only growing, that there are sort of protective factors, resources, support that can offset some of that stress and provide like a sense of safety. The idea of minority stress is a theoretical framework that has been used a lot over the last like 30-ish years to describe mental health disparities within both the queer, like LGBTQ community, as well as specifically the transgender community and gender non-conforming community. The minority stress theory basically says that there are stressors that all human beings experience in their lives, and those who have a minoritized identity characteristic, so that could be race, it could be sexual orientation. In the case of transgender folks, we're usually looking at like a minoritized gender identity. Those minoritized folks experience stressors that are unique to that minoritized identity, and that directly correlates to negative mental health outcomes. So again, this framework has been used in sort of the scientific academic research for at least I think the last like 15, 20 years. And it's looked at all sorts of things in terms of manifestations of structural stigma, harassment, discrimination, school bullying, peer victimization, those types of things as minority stressors that are unique in terms of how they are applied to the transgender population that directly correlate to increased loads of depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, even, as well as things like substance use, eating disorders. So we see a lot of disparities in the literature in the transgender population specifically, compared to both the general population as well as within the LGBTQ population, even. Transgender folks experience like disparate rates of all of those negative mental health outcomes. So when thinking about, that framework of minority stress, to me at least, it emphasizes the importance of providing resources and support directly to that community because they just have a greater mental health burden based on the fact that they're living in a world that wasn't necessarily built to support them as much as it is the cis majority. I think that in terms of, any therapeutic setting or any sort of clinical setting, so we could talk about any level of care, interventions, I mean, and interventions is even a strong word, but things that help to normalize gender diversity and destigmatize it. So examples of that are sort of like on the institutional level would be having a gender neutral restroom available for staff members to have their pronouns in their Zoom title like we do, or their email signature, those types of things. I think that also lots of clinical organizations will sort of directly call out on marketing materials or admissions materials, those types of things, that we are a gender affirming organization, just to sort of signal that we have that perspective. Because again, when we talk about gender affirming mental health care, oftentimes it's a matter of awareness and knowledge and sort of a continuous intentional striving towards being able to serve that population as best as possible. So those types of like organizational facets are definitely signal like we are an organization who kind of is aware of that and prioritizes it and knows its importance in thinking, especially in terms of like the IOP setting or even like a PHP or inpatient setting. I think that one thing that really maybe differentiates the dorm, something the dorm does well, is in our offering of Dwell as like a residential component that is, to my understanding, advertised, marketed, and executed as a gender affirming living situation. So I think that is something that's an example of not just talking the talk, but walking the walk. I also think about, in the IOP setting, having offerings in terms of groups, in terms of clinicians, in terms of resources or that type of thing that are geared specifically towards the gender expansive and trans populations. I run in the New York City location a transgender non-binary process group once a week. So that's like a space that is particularly for those folks. So having offerings like that, I think that also in terms of like community engagement and community activities, I think that we are in a very unique position based on the model that we have and like the community element that there's a lot of really great opportunities to model for our clients, sort of like what are the soft skills that are included in normalizing and destigmatizing gender diversity? I think a lot of that can look like correcting each other when somebody makes a mistake with names or pronouns, educating somebody on if language that they're using is stigmatizing in some way. So those are all things that I think are very important, can play out very differently in different situations, but I think that the dorm has, on several different levels, a focus toward trying to be not only like inclusive, but, somewhat empowering. One of the biggest protective factors that has been shown to like really help protect trans youth, trans young adults specifically from disproportionate mental health burden is parental and familial support. So that has been something that buffers those minority stressors. So, if a trans child is experiencing a lot of bullying in school, there are policies that don't allow them to do certain things with agency or autonomy. Having a safe or comfortable or affirming space at home, having parents who are supportive and affirming can help to mitigate any like negative mental health outcomes for those folks. And I think that there is a generational divide among a lot of families that can be really detrimental, and it's nobody's fault. I think that an awareness of the transgender population has sort of entered the cultural zeitgeist a lot more over the last like 20 years, and there's been a very, very steep learning curve in terms of awareness and education around just like knowing that that population exists. And so what we're seeing is there's a lot of people in the baby boomer generation, the Gen X generation, that are having to learn via their children or their family members sort of how to relate to these people and how to show love and care and affection in a way that is affirming and validating. So I think that we at the dorm, because of the fact that we engage the family, we have a very, very unique and somewhat crucial opportunity to help educate parents, providing psychoeducation and sometimes even just about the importance of family support and how it is such an important protective factor because sometimes that helps to motivate parents to really engage in that kind of learning.